On June 4, 1962, the Oswalds boarded the Maasdam in Amsterdam and sailed to the USA. Once on board the ship, Lee's paranoia, anxiety, and delusions of grandeur began to creep back into his personality. The closer the ship got to the US, Lee became convinced he would be arrested upon arrival. Lee ignored Marina, and she seldom left the cabin. It was as if this transition back to his roots summoned forth all of the demons from his childhood. Lee spent much of his time on board writing down his political beliefs. 4 sheets of Holland America Line stationery survive with Oswald's writing and ideas. The collective written by Oswald in the Soviet Union contrasts sharply with material that Oswald seems to have written after he left the Soviet Union, which appears to be more an expression of his own psychological condition than a reasoned analysis. He had experienced both political systems for a 23-year-old and found them lacking. His seeking had not found anything that he thought he would find. This dilemma provides increasingly strong forces acting on Oswald's emotional states. Lee hits Marina for the first time on the crossing. The Oswalds arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, on June 13. Lee became increasingly anxious as they headed to immigration and scanned the dock area for any sign of police. However, the only person looking for them that day was someone from the Travelers Aid Society. The U.S. State Department alerted the agency and sent them to help the Oswalds. Lee claimed on his entrance form that he had no money. This was a lie. Lee had money but wanted the U.S. government to pay for all their expenses. The welfare agency contacted Lee's brother Robert. Robert sent Lee $200 for plane fare to Dallas. June 14, 1962, Lee goes to Western Union and picks up the money. He bought 2 tickets for Delta Flight 821 at the West Side Air Terminal for $183. The Oswalds flew from Idlewild Airport to Dallas Love Field. Upon arrival, Robert, Vada, and their children are there to meet Lee, Marina, and June. The Oswalds move in with Lee's brother Robert in Fort Worth. Lee asks his brother where all of the reporters are. Robert said a front-page article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram was published the previous week with the heading, "Ex-Marine on way back from Russia." Even though Robert Oswald's home was a small single-story middle-class American home, Marina was amazed that only a single family lived there. Her first taste of the American way of life, and she loved it. June 15, Marguerite, Lee's mother, makes her first appearance. Marguerite tells Lee she is writing a book about his experiences. Lee looks at her and says, "No, mother, you are not writing a book." The great psychopathological drama of Lee Harvey Oswald's life had come full circle. He had left Marguerite, the Marines, and Mother Russia, and now the genesis of all his mental instability returned to his life. Lee's significant needs were never met, and always required a new mother figure. Lee hits Marina one evening at Robert's. This will become a recurring pattern of abuse. It will ebb and flow as Lee's mood swings and anger builds and dissipates. New anxiety patterns now emerged in Lee Oswald's life. Lee had left the United States as a teenager and returned as an adult, married with a child, with miserable prospects for decent employment given his level of education, social aloofness, and obsession with communism. These elements and his temper and immaturity create a lost individual whose grasp on reality is eroding daily. June 26, Lee is interviewed by the FBI for the first time at their office in Fort Worth. The agents describe Lee as tense, drawn up, and rigid. He was asked if he was recruited as an agent to be able to get Marina out of the country. The interview lasted 2 hours, and Lee lied about never having sought Soviet citizenship or offering radar secrets to the Russians. Lee becomes enraged and thinks the FBI and US government think he's a Soviet spy. In 1962, the FBI was decades away from developing its profiling techniques. Given Oswald's strange behavioral quirks, he might have been put on a watch list and seen more often. In 1962, Oswald was thought to be a political nutcase. A young person obsessed with communism and all things Marxist. Lee doesn't give the agents an impression of a dangerous person. But the agents need in-depth background information on Lee. July 14th, the Oswalds move in with Marguerite at 1501 West 7th Street in Fort Worth. They move out after less than a month. Marguerite would lose her temper with Marina and scream at her, saying, "You took my son away from me." July 17th, Lee starts work at Louvain-Pack division of the Leslie Welding Company. The job was heavy manual labor which Lee hated. August 16th, the FBI interviews Lee a second time. They arrive at the Mercedes Street address and ask him to come to their car and talk with them. The agents explain they don't want to upset Marina. The FBI used 2 separate informants to confirm that Oswald and Marina had no contact with any known local communists in the area. Lee now had a job and was more open with the agents during the interview. Agent Fain recommended that the FBI closed its case on Lee Harvey Oswald, and they did. After the last FBI visit, Lee is experiencing constant anxiety, and becomes increasingly paranoid. He now hits Marina weekly, giving her bruises and black eyes. Marguerite sees Lee hitting her and even testifies to the Warren Commission that sometimes women must get a black eye. Marina becomes more concerned about Lee's behavior since returning to the US. She is, in fact, baffled by the change in him. The Oswalds are now arguing constantly. Marina is losing weight, and looks malnourished. In an attempt to make amends to Marina, Lee gets in touch with the Russian émigré community so Marina can have someone to talk to. August 25th, the Oswalds attend a dinner party at the home of Peter Gregory, where they meet several members of the local Russian expat community. They met Anna Meller, George Bush, and Garley and Max Clark. Marina was the main attraction that evening, and Lee dressed well that evening in a jacket, tie, and white shirt with French cuffs. They are anxious to meet Marina, hear about current conditions, and listen to the everyday language of a young Russian. Russians judge other Russians by the way they speak the language. Marina made many good impressions that evening, as her speech showed she possessed sophistication and education. The Russian community wants to help the Oswalds. They sense that Marina is having significant difficulties and is overwhelmed by her new life in the USA. In their visits to Oswald's home, they see that June doesn't have a crib or a playpen. They notice that there is little food in the refrigerator. Marina's clothes are inappropriate for the intense Texas heat. They begin helping Marina and June. The community is puzzled that Lee refuses to let Marina learn English. They all sense that Lee is a very mixed-up individual who is aloof, arrogant, and still under the spell of communism. Lee's collection of Soviet magazines confirms their suspicions. September 1962, the Oswalds meet George de Mohrenschildt and his wife. Although the Russian émigrés eventually abandoned Marina when she made no sign of leaving her husband, Oswald found an unlikely friend in 51-year-old Russian émigré George de Mohrenschildt, a well-educated petroleum geologist with international business connections. A native of Russia, de Mohrenschildt was from a wealthy Russian family during the time of the Tsars. George had contacts all over the world. George enjoyed talking politics with Lee. George will become a father figure to Lee. October 9th, Oswald visits the Texas Employment Commission in Dallas, where he scores well on aptitude tests. He also rents a P.O. box under his name at the main post office. October 11th, Oswald is referred to Jagger's Child Stovall Company, a graphic arts company, by the Employment Commission and is hired as a photoprint trainee. November 5th, the Oswalds have a violent argument, and Lee hits Marina. Marina and June move in with their friends, the Mellors, for a few days. November 17th, Marina and June spend the day at the home of Mrs. Frank Ray. Lee calls and asks to visit Marina. She agrees to return to him. They return to the Elsbeth Street address that night. When Marina returned with Lee, the Russian community decided they had enough of the Oswalds and stopped their support. November 22nd, on Thanksgiving Day, the Oswalds visit Robert's home, where Lee and his half-brother John Pick reconcile after 10 years. This would be the last time Lee would see Robert or Marguerite until they visited him at the Dallas City Jail the following year. December 28th, Jean de Mohrenschildt arranged for the Oswalds to attend a combination of Christmas and New Year's parties at the home of Declan and Katya Ford. Katya had hoped she had seen the last of the Oswalds and reluctantly agreed to let them come. December 31st, 1962, Lee falls asleep at 10 p.m. Marina is alone and worried about what the new year will bring. January 25, 1963, Oswald makes the final 2 payments on the State Department loan. January 27, 1963, Lee fills out a form to Seaport traders in Los Angeles and sends them $10 to order a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. The gun had been modified so the barrel was only 2 1/4 inches long. The form was signed by A.J. Heidel. February 13, 1963, the Oswalds attend a dinner party at the home of the de Mohrenschildts. George and Lee discussed the John Birch Society and its most visible spokesman, General Edwin Walker. Marina would remember this evening as the turning point in Lee's increasing instability. "Anybody who bumps that bastard off will be doing this country a favor," is heard at the party that evening. Lee had been studying maps and was already thinking about shooting Walker. But his pistol had not arrived, and he could not act just yet. February 14th, Dallas Morning News article about General Walker joining right-wing evangelist Billy James Hargis in a cross-country speaking tour beginning February 27th in Miami, and ending in Los Angeles on April 3rd. February 16th, Marina tells Lee she is pregnant. February 17th, Dallas Morning News feature story on Walker's crusade, including calling for the invasion of Cuba. Lee makes Marina write to the Soviet embassy in Washington, asking officially that she and June be allowed to return without Lee and that she needs material aid for the journey. Marina has no desire to return to the Soviet Union. She can't understand why Lee wants to get rid of her. Lee now starts beating Marina more severely. She locks him out of the apartment, but he breaks a window and lets himself back in the house. February 22nd, the Oswalds attend a dinner party at the home of Everett Glover, where they meet Ruth Payne. February 23rd, Walker's last Saturday in Dallas before going on the speaking tour. Lee is gone the entire day, probably spying on Walker. Lee's neighbors went to the building manager and complained about the Oswalds fighting. The building's owners paid a visit to Lee. They tell him to stop fighting or move. Lee knew he had to move. There were too many eyes and ears on Elsbeth Street. March 2nd, the Oswalds moved to 214 West Neely Street. March 9th and 10th, Lee takes photographs of the home of General Edwin Walker while he is out of town on the speaking tour. March 12th, Ruth Payne visits Marina at the new apartment. Ruth felt sorry for Marina. Ruth's upbringing as a Quaker had moved her to learn Russian in hopes of creating a dialogue between the Soviets and the US. She enjoyed talking Russian with a native speaker and helping Marina. Also that day, Lee orders a rifle from Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago. March 25th, the rifle arrives at the post office, and the pistol is at Love Field. Lee picks up the weapons. March 29th, Lee takes his rifle and practices at the Trinity River bottoms. This is a common practice in the Dallas area that continues today. March 31st, Marina takes the infamous backyard photos of Lee at the Neely Street address. Lee is dressed in all black and holding two communist newspapers, his rifle with his pistol strapped to his belt. Marina laughs at Lee during the photo session, telling him he looks ridiculous. She can't understand what he's up to. April 1st, 1963, Lee is fired by Jaggers Childs Stovall. His work was subpar, and he was disliked by all of his co-workers for his rudeness and bad attitude. April 2nd, the Oswalds attend a dinner party at the home of Ruth and Michael Payne, where General Walker is mentioned. Michael Payne no longer lived with Ruth but visited weekly to see the children. Michael was an engineer at Bell Helicopter who had very liberal political views. His conversation with Lee that evening about Walker would have taken a very dim view of General Walker's activities and point of view. April 3rd, Marina notices Lee sneaking out of the house. The second-story apartment has a second entrance that leads directly to Lee's office. April 4th, Lee buries his rifle close to a footpath leading to General Walker's house. On the evening of April 10, 1963, Lee digs up the buried Carcano rifle and sneaks up to General Edwin Walker's home in the Highland Park area of Dallas under cover of darkness. Oswald fires at Walker through an open window. Oswald reburies the rifle as he uses the cover of a church that had just let out to conceal his departure from the area. After catching two buses, Oswald returns to the Neely Street duplex after 11 p.m. Marina is waiting for him. Lee comes inside, panting and pale. Marina asks him where he's been, seeing that he is upset about something. Lee says that he shot Walker. Marina asks him why he did such a thing, and Lee explains that Walker was a fascist and needed to be killed.